All right, so we're here to talk about phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication and phishing-resistant authentication in general, right? And whether it's MFA or just auth, they're kind of all one and the same. And just give a little background on things here, right? So in May of 2021, there was Executive Order 14028 that came out. And about 7 months later, we've got another memorandum coming out directing federal agencies that are under the executive branch to do a bunch of things regarding cybersecurity. But one of those is around authentication, right, and implementing strong authentication. So within all these documents, there's this line I pulled out here. Federal staff have enterprise managed accounts, allowing them to access everything they need to do their job while remaining reliably protected from even targeted, sophisticated phishing attacks. And just leave this up because this kind of has really started to snowball in the industry. And even though this is a federal mandate, it's really helping out a lot of corporations, anyone that's really using identity from any cloud identity provider, right? But here we're talking about Microsoft, so Azure AD. And you can sort of see that they've spurred things on with changes and things like conditional access. And right, so folks that have used conditional access, it used to be, if you wanted to do MFA, it was kind of on or off and anything could satisfy that. Now Microsoft has implemented changes where you can say what the authentication strength is. So if it's phishing resistant, if it's passwordless, if it's other forms of multi-factor. And not all this technology is new, right? So Hello for Business, which is phishing resistant, has been around since 2017, right? The mid-2010s as well, FIDO keys and eventually FIDO2 coming out from folks like Yubico and whatnot, right? And these things have existed for almost a decade now, right? But we're really just starting to see, what I'd say, things mature here as kind of snowball effect for going phishing resistant. So, one other thing is, a big theme in this conference is, ransomware and in general, right? We're all scared of ransomware. And Alex mentioned yesterday that through things like business email compromise that folks can get ransomware, but there's another aspect of business email compromise that isn't necessarily taking down organizations at scale of ransomware. And so if we look at some business email compromise or BEC figures here, between April 2022, April 2023, according to this Microsoft Cyber Signals report, came out in May, 35 million annual business email compromise attempts. And this is just in Office 365, right? So Azure AD environments, not anything consumer-oriented, which equates to 156,000 a day. And then Microsoft's digital crime unit, in the same time, took down over 400,000 phishing URLs, right? And so I've sort of enjoyed, in a way, getting to help some folks analyze some phishing attacks. And it's very common to see that they'll go out to Namecheap, buy a domain, and it can vary whether they're typo squatting or in some cases they don't even really put in much effort. But I mean, this is a ton of domains and URLs to take down, right? And this is only, what Microsoft is seeing. Where I think it also gets interesting is if you look at the FBI IC3 crime report from 2022, right, so we look at these numbers on domestic adjusted losses. While ransomware is bad, right, business email compromise losses through other financial means, it's a sizable number here, right? So 98.7 of the total domestic losses in the US are related to business email compromise that is not ransomware deployments. And so I kind of like to think of this as, right, almost like if you get sick from something bacterial, right? you could get very sick and get sepsis or something, and you're going to die, and they'll give you antibiotics, right? And that's sort of like the ransomware in organizations. But a lot of folks get sinus infections, right? You still might go to the doctor, get some sort of antibiotic, but those things don't really kill anyone, right? And so the thing here, I guess, with this data that we see is, it's all these small things that happen in organizations that don't really amount to much, right? Nobody's going out of business. Nobody's dying from a lot of these cases of business email compromise, right? Usually the money extracted from the threat actors is small enough that folks just kind of get a slap on their hand and people keep going about their business. And so in particular, I actually encountered this with a customer in 2019. So when I was at Microsoft, and if anyone here was at our user conference for Sempris on Tuesday, this will sound similar to one of the stories. So a university medical center had very feverishly wanting to roll out multi-factor authentication, get brought in to help them implement that in their Azure Active Directory. And talking to their engineer that owns Azure AD and whatnot, he was telling me that essentially what is spurred this on is their CFO was phished, and they had no multi-factor at the time, and after sat in their email for a bit of time, and then sent an email to one of their administrative folks, and authorizing a transfer of $400,000 roughly out to some bank, and that's lost money essentially, right? And so, well, there were two scary things. Well, one, it was actually because it was October 2019, Microsoft had a North American MFA outage, which does not look good the week that you're there trying to deploy MFA for a customer. But the scarier thing is right there, especially at the time, they were hot on SMS, right? They have to support students as well. And for faculty, they're trying to push, push notifications or OTP. But right 4 years ago, the MFA that we implemented there, you could still phish today. And when we look at the demo, you'll see that it's almost too easy to do this stuff.
Just a quick question on that. That whole business email compromise comes down to somebody authorizing money transfers mainly, or is there other examples?
It mostly seems to be money transfers, right? So, if you look at folks that are targeted, a lot of times it's to, your finance team or things like that. But there's also interesting things where I'll say I just know of other phishing attempts where it might be to actually get customer contacts. And in one case, the customers were then being contacted and being told that, hey, we have updated the account that you need to send us money to when you pay your monthly bill, right? So, and honestly, I think one of the things that's interesting is the threat actors have a very good understanding of human behavior, right? And there is that whole human element that kind of gets talked about through here that they certainly, right? They may send very crappy phishing emails at times, but their understanding of the human mind is quite well there. So, no, and there's some other resources. I kind of do this as a hobby because I'm like a passwordless nerd, but when you go read other reports from people that are like full-time into phishing, the stuff that these threat actors come up with is kind of amazing and not necessarily a good way. So, so if we look at Entra ID and authentication strengths here, and on the screen we can see that, right, we have 4 modes of passwordless available right now. But as Alex showed yesterday, same data here, right? That only 3 are phishing resistant, device-bound passkeys, right? And that's in the Entra world of things. Windows Hello for Business, and certificate-based authentication. When it's being used with as a form of multi-factor here, right? And so the authenticator phone sign-in, which has become wildly popular, right, and is better than nothing, as we'll see here, is still easily phishable. But before we get into sort of demos and kind of flow through things, I just wanted to touch on passkeys in FIDO2, right? Because if we look here, we see device-bound passkey, and folks may wonder, well, what the hell is that? right? So these passkeys that have been popular for about the past year or so when the term was kind of coined, right? In the consumer space, and it's being rolled out in Apple and Android and all these ecosystems, right? We tend to think of passkey as just this thing that is that syncable credential, right? When Alex was talking about how the private key material can be exported, right, and held in some sort of cloud system and transferred between devices, right? And those are effectively multi-device passkeys. So when we talk about FIDO2 and what we've been rolling out for, or trying to get organizations to roll out for several years now, right, depending on the vendor you talk to, but in the Microsoft world, it's effectively a device-bound passkey or a non-syncable passkey, right? So I built workshops and stuff at Microsoft, so I also have all these educational pieces of things I like to integrate into stuff. So just so when you start to see passkey, and this is going to sort of change in the industry, that a device-bound passkey is still your FIDO2 key from Yubico and everyone else. So, all right. So we're going to walk through just sort of a diagram of modern phishing attack on OTP, and then we'll have a hopefully live demo of things with a recording if that doesn't work. Right. So we've got our user here on your left here, right, who is phished, right? They fall for the hook. And they open that email for this phishing site, right? And they start performing their authentication, in this case, right? And they get redirected to, the Azure AD sign-in screen, right? So they're putting in their username and their password, and this proxy in this example, right, just sort of sits in the middle, passes that traffic on to Enter ID. And again, a lot of these systems are becoming increasingly more sophisticated, where it's scraping everything, and it is really like a web proxy. So any branding, anything that you may do or apply to your login screen for Entra is going to get passed back through, right? So they perform auth, the system captures their password, right? Now we're getting prompted for MFA, right? It proxies that back to the user. They input that MFA response, right? So your OTP, whether you got it through SMS, or right, you open your authenticator app, you send that back to Enter ID through the proxy. Enter ID returns those tokens, right? And this is web-based here in this example, so tokens, cookies, it's kind of all the same, right? But the thing you can see here now is that, well, the user, in many cases, is still sent on to something that's valid, and they may still not even know that they've been phished, right? That threat actor has those tokens necessary to impersonate the user, right? So they can easily go again, take these cookies, their refresh token and access token for whatever the system is, go replay those, and they'll just be in, right? And Microsoft has some pretty good protections these days to recognize this stuff is happening after the fact, but it's not immediate enough. And as far as phone signing goes, right, the flow is going to look very similar here, but just because a lot of people, in particular, when I was talking with folks who, were implementing passwordless and they were kind of confused, well, how is phishing working here, right? Because this is supposed to be passwordless. Like, how can these credentials be stolen? So, similar flow, right? User opens that email, they fall for the lure, right? This time we're going to do, passwordless. It's proxied to Enter ID. Right? Enter ID comes back with number matching at this point, right? Asking to perform number matching. And that's just passed on to the user. Now, the problem that we have right now with the way that passwordless works is out of band, right? Entra sends a push notification to the Authenticator app on your mobile device. The user enters that number, and right, that is sent back. And so even though right up here, there is a relationship between this device and Enter ID. Right? When you go set up passwordless, you have to register your device. But because it's out of band, right, the authentication session here has no idea that there's something else going on with this person being a attacker in the middle scenario here. So since we're not really aware of this, Entra just gives us that refresh token, access token, form of cookies. Users sort of on their merry way. And again, we're getting we're getting phished here and we're getting some credentials. So we will do a bit of a demonstration here. So in this, I'm using EvilGenix, easily available. I spun up a VM in Azure, running this on Windows to be super lazy so I don't have to remember Linux. If you can read a manual, I mean, this stuff literally takes 10 minutes to set up. So we'll fire this up. And I've already pre-configured this, but now we have our malicious proxy going. And we'll come out here. Right, and so right now you can see login phish entra.ms. When they announced Entra last year, I went and immediately bought that domain. So if anyone from Microsoft wants to buy it from me, it could be for sale. Right, and so you see that this test tenant that I have, right, I've got all my branding and everything, right, and it just passed through here. So let me perform my number matching. Right, and so I'm in here as Alex Wilbur. And so as I was doing that, if we look at EvilGenix here, right, we can see that we actually captured Alex's, username here. And we also actually have authorization tokens. If we had debug on, you could also actually get a copy of Alex's password. Right, and so now, let me do this. And so if you look right here, this is essentially all those browser cookies that would have been set, right? So these are tokens for access, right? And we can see that I am not signed into anything right now. There's no magic. I'd actually thought of asking if anyone wanted to be phished, like a magic trick, but there's probably some liability thing with that. So open cookie editor, just delete everything that we got going on. Right. We're going to import those cookies that we just got out of EvilGenix. Right. We can see we have all of basically our tokens here now represented. Just refresh. Right. And I'm in as Alex. Now, again, if you have things like identity protection, thank you very much. So, right, and if you have identity protection, it will pick this stuff up. And again, from just my own analysis and seeing how things work from people that look at this stuff and research it full time, that a lot of times the threat actor will actually have one system set up that's collecting the tokens, and then they'll usually use something like DigitalOcean, not to pick on DigitalOcean, spin up systems in North America, and then replay those tokens from other places in heavily populated cities, right? And that's some effort to try to sort of, right, not have to deal with impossible travel scenarios and all those sorts of things. So, we've seen the problem. What is the solution here, right? And just a bit of history, because I think the thing that's interesting is when you kind of dig into this, we've actually had the answer for this laying around for quite a long time. So up on the screen here, we've got, in 1988, right, so that's going back 30-something years, the International Telecommunication Union, right, defined a bunch of authentication frameworks, and they wrote X509, right? And for folks that aren't in the identity world, right, usually familiar with X509 certificates because they're also what's used for SSL, right? So in the mid-90s, when Netscape wrote the first draft of SSL, and they specified using X509 certificates, right? And this is now TLS these days, but it's still all, right? Using those X509 certificates for encryption. And this is a bit of a brief, sort of history of things, so not extensive. If you look sort of in the late 80s, early 90s, there's a lot of work also going on with things like smart cards and whatnot as well, and other forms of authentication where even if you read some of these papers, right, they're talking about how these forms of authentication would be resistant to, attacker in the middle scenarios, but we didn't live in the world we live in today. So it, I mean, for the most part, it seemed like it wasn't important, especially in, most commercial spaces, right? And then in the, 2006, right? So NIST published FIPS 201-1, which was their first draft of PIV or PIV, right? The personal identity verification, right? Which is effectively smart cards for, federal employees and contractors. And right, it's not just federal space. You see commercial places using smart cards and everything like that as well in certain scenarios, right? If you have to fall under like CGIS requirements and stuff like that as well on certain state levels. But again, to me, this is where it kind of was a big turning point if you kind of dig into the history where using certificate-based authentication, asymmetric key pairs, public-private key, right? It's all sort of the same thing. Kind of started to grow, but again, right, commercial spaces didn't really adopt this stuff. So then in the mid-2010s, W3C and the FIDO Alliance, right, start working on WebAuthn. This is the first draft. They're on like a V2 of this now. And a lot of times when you look at phishing-resistant authentication, you'll see WebAuthn, CTAP. Together, CTAP is client to authenticator protocol, which is what's effectively handling the ability, right, for me to put in my FIDO2 key into my device and securely communicate with my browser. WebAuthn is the thing that's handling traffic between your browser, right, on your device or whatnot, and the relying party on the other end, in this case, Entra ID. Right, and that kind of gets into where, we're talking about this as far as a, authentication perspective, right? This is all based off of, public-private key pairs, right? So certificates, if we would kind of want to put it in, easier terms here. And so we look at those authentication strengths again, right? And this is where those device-bound passkeys and passkeys in general, when, as Alex was alluding to, eventually, Entra ID will support, Hello for Business and certificate-based auth, right, are all public key pairs, right? And our problem ultimately is passwords, OTP, all that sort of stuff is shared secrets, right? Because when you set up OTP, there's still a seed that is, on your device, and effectively, right, that number that you look at on your phone, you get through your text, on the back end in your IDP somewhere, it's like, because it's the same seed that's shared, it's the same number, and it's just comparing two numbers. So, and this is ultimately what, one of the things is that gets into where passkeys become non-phishable. However, the thing is that, folks may also say, well, that's great, but, if you're familiar with just, networking and, managing web servers and stuff and proxies, you can say, well, right, like we have the server in the middle, like why can't we just intercept traffic, right? And why can't we just, right, we're sitting in the middle, capture that traffic, sign it with whatever we want to sign here, right? So this time, though, with passkeys, the user opens that malicious link to the phishing site, right? And they select, though, that they want to use, their FIDO2 security key within Azure AD. And initially, like the proxy usually will still sort of attempt to authenticate the user, right? Because it's not going to stop trying, so it passes that on to Entra. In this case, though, Entra is going to essentially send like a challenge, right? Like a nonce back to us and say, hey, we need to sign this, right? And there's your private key that's going to be on your FIDO2 key that we would use for signing, right? So it's pass back to the user, but there's this thing called origin checks that are both implemented in the relying party, and in this case, relying party, we're talking about Entra, but also in modern browsers, right? And so these origin checks effectively are looking at the URL. So when you register your key, right, there's a whole bunch of sort of metadata on it. And one of them is like, well, what is the relying party? What is the IDP that this private key is associated with? And right, so effectively, if they don't match, at this point, the browser will just, not even do anything, which we will hopefully see again in a demo in a second here when Alex tries to use his FIDO2 key. And I think, yesterday when Alex was talking about how, we're not calling it phishing proof, and only phishing resistant. I have seen one paper come out maybe in the past couple of years where someone wrote about how, they've sort of cracked FIDO2. But ultimately what they did is they owned the whole infrastructure end to end, right? So when we talk about origin checks and we're looking at, the host name for our identity provider, effectively they owned an organization's, this is all theoretical, DNS. They own the infrastructure, right? They owned their CA so that they could impersonate, right, fully, login.microsoftonline.com or something like that. So, I mean, right, there's people out there certainly trying to figure this out. But I think realistically, when you see that sort of stuff, it's just some security researchers that kind of just get a little dramatic in how they publish their research. So, right, and I mean, I'm using this for demonstration purposes, but also as a huge passwordless person, I would say right now, right, like because some organizations find this very difficult to roll out. Especially these days, enable Windows Hello for Business, right? And I could go on a rant for hours about how if you can protect, 30, 40, 50, 70, 80, 90% of your organization, right, with Hello for Business, it takes almost nothing to roll it out these days. And a lot of times organizations will focus on the fringe cases and all those things and say, if it's not all or nothing, right, we're just not going to do it. But hopefully, if you're using SMS or OTP or whatnot, this scares you that someone that's a mediocre sort of hacker can basically go out to a GitHub site and get this stuff set up in 20 minutes. So I enrolled this earlier, right? And so part of FIDO2 or part of WebAuthn is the attestation piece where I'm basically proving I'm, me here. So it's still going to ask me for my PIN. And we can actually see that, right, there is some traffic flowing. I don't have debug on here because there'd be too much on. You can see that, this initial attempt to authenticate is hitting our proxy server. But I'll pop in my PIN. Right, and you get this security key doesn't look familiar. And this basically just times out and you can't go any further. And this is where you can see that this is actually all happening on the client side. Because if we looked in EvilGenix here, I mean, there's basically no traffic coming back to this, right? And then hopefully, again, if somehow we were able to get the user to actually sign that and get it somehow proxied back, that, again, right, we're talking about layer protection, the IDP should also see the origin is different and sort of drop that authentication attempt. So, simple stuff. Getting easier to implement. If you don't think it's that easy to implement, love to talk to you sort of after the session or sometime later, because right, it's not going to solve everything, right? And there's certainly challenges with having a bunch of LDAP applications or whatnot in organizations, but from right where your users are getting phished, it's things like Office 365, it's their email, right? It's these systems, right? So, and I think with that, it is.
There doesn't seem to be an understanding as to the user's data. They think that their facial image or their fingerprint is being stored, and therefore there's resistance to adoption. So what is being done out there to educate the...
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I mean, I would tend to find, honestly, one of the big things, not to get too off topic, but with rolling out passwordless where there's biometrics is like organizational change management and helping people build a understanding of the technology, right? And so with Hello for Business in particular, and even if it was like a biometric FIDO2 key, right? It's all resident on the device and it's like a hash, right? So it's not a picture of your face or like, right? I mean, it's one way, and I get hashes aren't like necessarily bulletproof. But for the most part, I mean, I would like to call, these keys like as a TPM on a stick, and right, Hello for Business is all stored on your TPM. And within that, the amount of engineering sort of put into place to secure sort of the data on it. But you also don't need to use biometrics. And Google actually kind of went a direction where they preferred not to use biometrics because they had a whole issue. If I carried this, and pretend this was biometric, if I carried this across the border, they could force me to have to touch the biometric thing, but they can't force me to say what my PIN is. So there's places where, not using biometrics is perfectly acceptable, and you don't need biometrics for Hello for Business. So, all right.
Any other questions?
Cool.
No.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.